In this quiet mystery, Miss Marple looks beyond myths and legends to uncover how the first American colonies truly began, not with conquest, but with human choices hidden beneath the surface of history. Welcome to the series of Drift Away Tales. I am your host Ilias. Chapter 1: The Whisper in the Map Room. Miss Marple had not planned to leave St. Mary Mead that autumn. The roses were still behaving beautifully, the air was crisp enough for peaceful evening walks, and she had promised herself a quiet season. But quiet never lasted long where mysteries lived, and this one arrived not with crime, but curiosity. It came in the form of an invitation, pressed into an envelope with a seal she had not seen in years. The handwriting was unmistakably American, long sweeps, confident strokes, no nonsense. Inside was a single letter from Dr. Helen Crawford, an American historian she had once met at a botanical conference. Dear Miss Marple, we have uncovered something extraordinary at the Maritime Museum of London. Documents suggesting the earliest American colonies may have started very differently than history claims. I believe someone has altered or hidden key papers. I need your mind here, at once. Miss Marple read the letter twice. The idea was absurd. Who would falsify history? And yet, people lie for pride, for power, for fear. She had seen it often enough. If someone had manipulated history itself, that was merely lying on a grander scale. She packed her neat suitcase, left a note for her neighbour, and boarded the first train to London. The Maritime Museum smelled of polished wood and long-kept secrets. Dr. Helen Crawford met Miss Marple at the entrance, tall, sharp-eyed, dressed in a navy coat that meant she never wasted time. Miss Marple, she said warmly, you look exactly as I remember, older, my dear. Miss Marple smiled. But I've learned a few more things about human nature since then. Helen led her upstairs to the map room, a chamber filled wall to wall with ancient charts, yellowed documents, and heavy glass cases. But the centerpiece of the room, and the reason Miss Marple was here, was a worn leather-bound journal laid open on a table. This, Helen whispered, should not exist. Miss Marple read the date on the first page, 1606. The year before Jamestown, Helen said. The year before history tells us the first colony began. Miss Marple leaned closer. The ink was faded but readable. We left not for gold, nor for the will of crown, but for fear of voices buried in the old land. She frowned. This doesn't sound like settlers escaping persecution, she said. It sounds like running. Helen nodded. And that is precisely the problem. Historians insist the colonies began with economic dreams or religious goals. But this journal suggests disaster. Miss Marple turned the page. Sketches filled the margins, coastlines, trees, strange markings she didn't immediately recognize. Who discovered this? She asked. A museum archivist, Helen replied. But the moment he brought it to me, someone else tried to claim it. Then the pages started disappearing. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. Disappearing. Yes, someone wants this truth buried, completely. Miss Marple folded her hands calmly. Then let us begin before they succeed. Miss Marple inspected the journal again, slowly, with the patience of someone who once solved a murder by the way a man buttered his bread. Every detail spoke, every missing detail shouted. 3 pages had been torn out, cleanly, carefully. The cuts were sharp. Helen, Miss Marple asked softly, who else knows about this document? Only a few scholars on staff, and the museum director, Mr. Alistair Webb. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. Is he trustworthy? Helen hesitated. He's ambitious, very ambitious. And he dislikes chaos. History is always chaos first, Miss Marple said, until someone tidies it up and calls it fact. A knock echoed at the door. A short, nervous man entered. Mr. Jonathan Pike, assistant archivist. His hands shook as he carried a stack of papers. Dr. Crawford, he said breathlessly, the director wants the journal moved to his private office, immediately. Helen stiffened. It stays here. Miss Marple watched Pike closely. His eyes avoided the journal. His left thumb brushed anxiously over a small smudge of ink on his cuff. Fresh ink. Ink, Miss Marple thought, recently used. Someone had been handling documents that did not wish to be seen. She stepped forward kindly. Mr. Pike, my dear, you look rather troubled. Is something the matter? He flinched. No, I'm fine. Miss Marple gently touched the top of the journal. Have you, by any chance, seen the missing pages? His breath caught. A tiny, involuntary thing, but enough. Helen stepped closer. Jonathan, the man trembled. I can't. I promised him. Promised who? Miss Marple asked softly. Before he could answer, the door swung open again, fast, forceful. Mr. Alistair Webb, tall and impeccably dressed, stepped inside. His smile was sharp as a blade. Miss Marple, Dr. Crawford, I hear you're stirring trouble. Only truth, Miss Marple said pleasantly. He eyed the journal. That book belongs under museum control. Helen stepped protectively in front of it. So does every artifact we haven't finished cataloguing. Miss Marple watched Webb's hands, perfectly manicured, perfectly steady. A man who did not fear lies, because he believed he controlled them. Mr. Webb, she said calmly, why are there pages missing? His smile did not change. Some things crumble with age. Miss Marple's own smile was kinder, not when they are cut with a razor. He stiffened, just a fraction, but enough for her to see the truth. He was hiding something. After Webb left, Helen locked the map room. Jonathan Pike lingered, wringing his hands. Miss Marple approached him quietly. My dear, when people hide history, they do it out of fear. You are afraid too, not of truth, but of someone. That journal, he whispered. If people knew why those settlers left England, it would change everything. Miss Marple nodded. Then we must find out why. Jonathan swallowed hard. The missing pages contain the reason. And where are they now? Miss Marple asked gently. He looked toward the window, trembling. Mr. Webb has them. And what do they say? Miss Marple asked. Jonathan's voice dropped to a whisper. They say the first settlers didn't flee for freedom. They fled because someone was hunting them. Miss Marple felt a cold stillness pass through the room. Not ghosts, not myths, but human danger, the kind that crosses oceans. Miss Marple leaned forward, eyes bright with a quiet fire. Then, she said softly, let us discover who hunted them, and why history hid it. And the investigation into the true beginning of the American colonies had begun. Chapter to the map that should not exist. The next morning broke with a brightness that felt almost artificial, as if the New England sun had decided to overperform for Miss Marple's arrival. She stepped onto the small veranda of the historian's guest house, a cup of steaming tea in hand, and stared at the harbour below. Fishing boats swayed gently, seagulls argued overhead. Everything looked harmless, perfectly harmless, and yet something about last night's whisper of a hidden beginning refused to leave her mind. Lydia Harrow, the young historian who had begged her to come across the ocean, hurried up the path, carrying a rolled leather case against her chest. Her spectacles were fogged from running. "Miss Marple, please, you must see this." Miss Marple lifted one eyebrow. Calm was morning-tide. "My dear, people who run with maps tend to be either in love or in trouble." Inside the cottage, Lydia unrolled the case with trembling fingers. A breath of cold air seemed to escape the leather, as if something old and cautious had been locked inside. What lay before them was a parchment so brittle it looked like it might sigh itself to dust at any moment. It was a map, and not of the 13 colonies, but of something older, much older. The parchment showed a jagged coastline, inked with faint symbols, circles, arrows, markings that didn't match any known European cartography of the 1600s. Instead, they resembled something else entirely. Something Miss Marple remembered from Greece, carved onto the stones at the bottom of an ancient well. But she said nothing yet. Lydia pointed to a cluster of symbols. This shouldn't exist. These markings match a pre-colonial navigational system used by early explorers. Before the English settlements, Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles. And yet here it is, existing quite comfortably. It was found sealed inside a wooden floorboard of the old meeting house, Lydia said. During restoration. Hidden away. Someone didn't want people to know. Miss Marple leaned closer until the ink patterns blurred into intention. Maps only hide when men fear what they reveal. Lydia nodded. The colonies didn't begin with the Mayflower. Not entirely. Someone was here earlier. Someone organized. Someone who left coded symbols. This map shows a settlement mark dated decades before official history says Europeans arrived. And now, Miss Marple said softly, someone seems intent on making sure such a map never sees daylight. Lydia looked frightened. "Do you think this is why Dr. Hargrove went missing?" Miss Marple folded the map gently. "My dear, scholars disappear only when the truth is too close to waking." The first place Miss Marple wished to see was not a museum or archive, but the old meeting house itself. Lydia led her there through cobblestone paths, still slick from morning fog. The building stood tall and rigid like an elderly soldier, its whitewood gleaming, its windows narrow and watchful. Inside, dust motes floated like patient witnesses. "This is where the map was hidden," Lydia whispered, "under that beam." Miss Marple approached the wooden plank, the one freshly pried open during renovation. Her fingers traced the edges. "Not amateur work," she murmured. "Whoever hid it knew how to conceal without damaging." Lydia watched. "Do you think it was the settlers themselves?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, "or perhaps someone who feared what the settlers would find." She knelt, eyes following the grain of the wood, hand cut, no nails. The wood was heated and bent into place. A very old technique. No one would notice unless they knew how to listen. Lydia blinked. "Listen, to wood," Miss Marple smiled. "Everything speaks if patience stands still long enough." She tapped lightly with her cane. The hollow sound echoed faintly. One hollow beam, one secret, still more to find. "Do you hear that?" Miss Marple whispered. Lydia held her breath. "What is it?" "A second hollow pocket," Miss Marple said. "This one untouched," Lydia gasped. Then, something else might be inside. They fetched the caretaker, Mr. Whitcomb, a thin, dignified man who looked like he'd been carved from the very beams of the meeting house. He knelt with slow respect, prying open the second hollow. Inside was a small sealed tin box, its metal weathered but intact. Miss Marple placed her palm atop it before opening, sensing the weight of years pressing through the metal. "What if?" Lydia whispered. This is dangerous to reveal. My dear, Miss Marple said softly, truth is rarely dangerous. It is only the protection of lies that grows teeth. She unlatched the box. Inside lay a handful of black stones, perfectly round, smooth as river pebbles, each etched with tiny marks resembling tally strokes. Lydia stared. Voting stones, Miss Marple nodded. Just like the ones found in the early Greek settlements. But what would Greek-style voting stones be doing in colonial America? Miss Marple turned one over delicately. Because colonies are not built only by ships, they are built by ideas. Some travelers brought more than hunger, and hope they brought memory. Lydia whispered. Then this map, these stones. These might show that democratic practices existed here before the colonies were officially formed. Or, Miss Marple said, that the colonies adopted what was already known. Mr. Whitcomb looked stunned. History, rewritten. History, Miss Marple corrected gently, reminded. But the moment's quiet all lasted only seconds. Because footsteps echoed sharply through the meeting house. Heavy, purposeful, familiar, Miss Marple tightened her grip on her cane. Lydia instinctively moved closer. A tall man in a grey coat stepped from the doorway. The same stranger Miss Marple had seen last night outside the Harbourside Inn. His eyes slid to the open box, then to the map rolled on the bench. So, he said smoothly, you found what did not wish to be found. Lydia whispered, you again, who are you? The man gave a polite, humorless smile. Someone who knows what happens when history is rearranged. And someone who will ask you to hand over that map. Before this becomes unpleasant, Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Calm as ever, she said. Young man, unpleasantness is what happens when men think secrets are safer than truth. The stranger took a step closer. Give me the map, now. Miss Marple didn't flinch. Instead, she looked him gently in the eyes and said, I never give anything to a man who arrives without announcing his name. The stranger didn't move, but something behind his gaze did. A flicker of uncertainty, a moment of hesitation, a single crack in his resolve. Miss Marple saw it, and she knew this was no ordinary thief. This was someone who feared history, because he belonged to the part of it nobody had meant to survive. Chapter 3: The Whispering Map. The moment Miss Marple unfolded the ancient map, the candle flame beside her trembled not from wind, but from the tension that suddenly filled the small harbour inn. Lydia leaned closer, eyes wide. That coastline, it looks like North America. Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. She traced the map's edges with one careful finger. The parchment was brittle, the ink almost faded into memory, but the shapes were unmistakable. A long eastern shoreline, broken by bays, rivers, forests. And then there it was, a tiny symbol, a circle drawn around one cove. A symbol shaped like a new moon with a line across it. Someone marked this long before the English ever settled there, Miss Marple whispered. This is not just a map. It is an instruction. A floorboard creaked behind them. Mr. Harrington, the American historian with too much confidence and too little patience, stepped inside. I believe you've found something that belongs to us, he said, trying and failing to sound casual. Miss Marple folded the map quietly. Belonging is a dangerous word, Mr. Harrington, she said. It starts wars and ends civilizations. He stiffened. Whatever is written there is American history. You have no idea how valuable this is. Oh, Miss Marple replied gently, but I do. And that was exactly why she would not hand it over. They gathered in the small sitting room of the inn, the map placed in the center of the table. Wind rattled the shutters. A ship's bell clanged distantly in the harbour. The entire scene felt like a prelude to discovery or danger. Lydia asked the question first. Miss Marple, do you think the earliest English explorers used this map? No, she said quietly. I think they feared it. Andreas frowned. Feared it? Why would they fear a map? Miss Marple pointed to the moon-shaped symbol. Because that marking was not drawn by English hands. This is older, much older. Harrington scoffed. Impossible. Europeans were the first to map that side of the world. Miss Marple gave him a look that melted arrogance, like butter left in sunlight. My dear sir, history does not depend on your expectations. Lydia breathed in sharply. So who drew it? Miss Marple leaned back, eyes half closed, letting her mind work through centuries of silence. Someone who travelled, someone who listened, someone who wanted to warn those who came after. There was a long pause. Harrington swallowed. Warn? Warn about what? Miss Marple opened her eyes. About what happens when foreigners meet already rooted civilizations, about conflict, about disease, about misunderstanding. The room fell silent. The map suddenly felt heavier than parchment. Later that evening, Miss Marple slipped away from the inn, walking toward the clock tower where the old archivist worked at night. Lydia followed quietly, knowing better than to interrupt the detective's thinking. The archivist, Mr. Dorworth, blinked in surprise when they entered. You're back, at this hour. Miss Marple placed the folded map on the table. Good evening. I need your eyes, Mr. Dorworth, your honest eyes, not your careful ones. He adjusted his spectacles and leaned over it. His eyebrows slowly climbed. This symbol, this ink, Miss Marple, this is Phoenician. Lydia gasped. Phoenician? But they sailed the Mediterranean thousands of years before the English. Dorworth nodded, and some believed they reached far beyond it. Miss Marple whispered, then the story of America's beginning is far older than any colonist's diary. The archivist looked up. If this is real, and it appears to be, you have found the oldest transoceanic map ever documented. Lydia sat down, overwhelmed. Miss Marple, this means the American colonies did not begin in 1607. They began in a warning sent centuries before. Miss Marple nodded. Someone knew other civilizations would rise, collide, misunderstand, and conquer. They tried to prevent it, the only way they knew, through a map that whispers across time. When Miss Marple and Lydia left the archive, the harbour street was unusually quiet, too quiet. A faint echo of footsteps followed behind them, quickening whenever Lydia quickened, slowing whenever Miss Marple paused. Lydia whispered, "Someone's following us." "I should hope so," Miss Marple said calmly. "Truth always attracts trouble." She turned a corner suddenly, pulling Lydia with her into a narrow alley that led behind the fish market. They hid behind crates smelling of salt and rope. A figure passed the alley mouth. "Mr. Harrington," he paused, scanning the shadows. "He wants the map," Lydia whispered. Miss Marple's voice was soft as falling snow. "He wants to control history, a common disease among scholars." After Harrington moved on, they slipped back to the inn. Miss Marple bolted the door and placed the map under the floorboard. Lydia exhaled shakily. We could be in danger." Miss Marple smiled. "My dear, history is always dangerous. But we are not here to rewrite it. We are here to understand it." She poured tea with absolute calm, and understanding is the only shield worth carrying. The next morning, Miss Marple awoke early and stepped outside to breathe the cold sea air. The sun had barely risen, painting gold across the bay. She opened her notebook and wrote, "History does not begin where we expect it. Sometimes its first chapter is buried beneath the arrogance of those who believe they wrote it. Lydia joined her moments later. "What now?" she asked. Miss Marple smiled. "Now we uncover the truth. Piece by piece. And the map. It stays hidden. For now." Lydia hesitated. "Why?" "It could change world history." Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the sea, where the first ships centuries ago must have crossed unknowingly toward continents already whispered about. "My dear," she said softly, "truth is like the tide, it must come in slowly, or it destroys the shore." Behind them, the inn door creaked. Harrington stood in the doorway, his expression dark and determined. "I know you have it," he said, "and I won't let you walk away with American history." Miss Marple turned to him calmly. "I am not walking away with your history," she said. "I am walking toward the truth." And for the first time, Harrington looked afraid not of her, but of the story she was beginning to unravel. Because Miss Marple now understood something he didn't. The origins of the American colonies were not merely voyages. They were consequences, and consequences always leave clues. Chapter 4. The Map That Should Not Exist. Miss Marple realized this the moment Lydia Hawthorne unfolded the brittle parchment on the inn's wooden table. The candle beside them flickered as though startled. Outside, the Massachusetts wind rattled the shutters like impatient knuckles. But all Miss Marple saw was the ink, the strange, looping lines, far older than the paper itself, drawn with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were hiding. "It was in the attic," Lydia whispered. "Inside a box marked household linen. But look at the coastline." Miss Marple leaned closer. The map did not show 13 colonies in neat borders. Instead, it showed scattered dots, each marked with small handwritten icons: a loaf, a sheaf of wheat, a compass, a lantern. Not military markers, not territorial claims. "Settlements," Lydia suggested. "No," Miss Marple murmured. "Intentions." She studied the bottom corner where faint words read, "For those who seek to live differently." A phrase too dangerous for its time. And exactly the kind of phrase someone would hide in an attic for 3 centuries. By mid-morning, the inn had become an unofficial headquarters. Lydia sorted artifacts, Thomas reviewed sketches, and Professor Grayson paced like a scholar, trying to outrun his doubts. Miss Marple stood near the window, hands folded, watching the harbour outside. Ships rocked gently on the tide, simple, quiet vessels. Nothing about them suggested rebellion or independence. Yet beneath that calm, the colonies had once brewed ideas bold enough to fracture empires. "What troubles you?" Lydia asked. "Patterns," Miss Marple replied. "People rarely hide maps unless they reveal what words alone cannot." She tapped the parchment gently. "There are no borders, no fences, only small circles. And each is connected by footpaths, not roads. These were not colonies founded by decree, but groups seeking something." Gentler, Professor Grayson halted mid-stride. "That history says the first settlers were trying to survive. Food shortages, harsh winters, conflicts, hardship forced them together." "Hardship," Miss Marple agreed, "but hardship often forces hierarchies. This map suggests the opposite, cooperation before authority." Lydia exhaled. "Do you mean democracy?" "Something older," Miss Marple said softly. "Community, before nations, before constitutions, before the world learned to call agreements by grander names." Their next clue came from a most unlikely source, the innkeeper's daughter, Emily, who approached shyly holding a bundle wrapped in cloth. "This was in the same attic box," she said. "Mama said you might understand it." Inside the wrapping lay a small wooden charm, carved into the shape of a lantern. Miss Marple held it carefully. The carving was old, not amateur, but deliberate. On the back was a tiny inscription, "Light for those who travel by choice, not command." Miss Marple's heart tightened. She had seen similar phrases in her investigations back in England on documents written by reformers who feared monarchy, lacked the power to oppose it openly. She turned the charm over and handed it to Lydia. "This," she said, "is a code, a symbol for meeting." "Meeting for what?" Thomas asked. "For decision-making," Miss Marple replied. "I suspect this charm mapped where people gathered to decide how they wished to live long before governors arrived." Grayson looked stunned. "Are you implying the earliest settlers held assemblies?" Miss Marple smiled. "Small ones, I imagine, around fires, not halls. Pebbles rather than ballots, but the seed is unmistakable." Lydia whispered. "Then the colonies weren't built by order, but by choice." "Exactly," Miss Marple said. "And that makes them far more interesting and far more dangerous to certain versions of history." The coastline on the parchments matched the harbour, though distorted. The footpaths led inland, weaving through forests and marshland like veins. The first marked circle lay half a mile from the inn, near a clearing. They reached it by late afternoon. At first glance, it appeared unremarkable, just a cluster of ancient stones arranged in a rough ring. But Miss Marple noticed the precision. Each stone, tilted slightly toward the center, each bore faint carving circles, lines, lantern shapes. Thomas knelt and brushed away moss. These weren't placed randomly. They were arranged. Miss Marple nodded. "Meeting stones." Grayson scoffed. "But why stones? Why outdoors?" "Because they were hiding in plain sight," Miss Marple said. "Quiet decisions disturb no tyrant, and quiet decisions repeated often become roots." Lydia looked around the clearing, her voice soft. "Do you think they voted here?" "Oh yes," Miss Marple whispered. "Not for power, for survival, for fairness. For how resources would be shared, for what rules would keep them from turning on one another." Grayson's expression shifted from disbelief to awe. "They weren't colonies yet," Miss Marple said. "They were experiments." And she suspected they had not been as disorganized as history claimed. As evening fell, they returned to the inn exhausted but alert. Miss Marple sat near the hearth, hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea. Lydia paced near her, energized. "What now?" Lydia asked. "If these were early assemblies, who started them? Who taught them the idea?" Miss Marple looked at the map once more. The dots, the lantern symbols, the footpaths. "Not taught," she said. "Remembered." "Remembered from where?" Thomas asked. Miss Marple's gaze grew distant, reaching back across oceans and centuries. "From Europe," she said. "From quiet villages and hidden gatherings. From places where ordinary people whispered about fairness long before kings wrote laws." She tapped the map softly. "These settlers did not bring the monarchy with them. They brought their longing." Lydia sank into a chair. "So the American colonies were founded, not on conquest, but on community." "As all good societies are," Miss Marple replied, "at least in the beginning." A long silence settled, filled only by the crackle of the fire. Then Miss Marple added in a voice barely above a breath, "And somewhere, someone knew this truth would be dangerous enough to hide in a box marked linen." Lightning, far off, illuminated the harbour. Miss Marple watched it calmly. "Tomorrow," she said, "we search for the second circle, and perhaps for the hand that built them." The mystery was no longer about colonies. It was about the quiet decisions that shaped the world and the people who wanted those decisions forgotten. Chapter 5: The Map That Shouldn't Exist. The knock came before sunrise, 3 sharp taps on Miss Marple's wooden guest-house door. She woke instantly, her instincts finely tuned from years of listening to the world breathe differently whenever a truth was about to appear. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and opened the door to find Lydia standing there, eyes bright with a mixture of fear and triumph. "You need to see this," Lydia whispered. They hurried through the cool morning air toward the small archives room beneath the village museum where Sir Roland kept his temporary collection. The sky was still pale, the first hints of gold spreading slowly over the horizon, as though the dawn itself hesitated to interrupt what was about to unfold. Inside the archive room, a lantern glowed on a cluttered table. Andreas stood beside it, hands trembling slightly as he unfolded an old leather-bound folio. "Where did this come from?" Miss Marple asked. "From the crate delivered last night," Andreas said. "The one the professor insisted we store without inspection." Sir Roland, standing in the corner with his arms crossed, shifted uncomfortably. "I was going to examine it, eventually." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Eventually is a dangerous word, Sir Roland. It leaves too much room for mischief." Lydia carefully turned the pages of the folio. Fragile maps, ink faded but legible, coastlines, symbols, notations in Old English and Dutch. Then she stopped. "This one," Lydia breathed. "It shouldn't exist." The map on the table was unlike the others, older, grittier, its edges burned and repaired. It showed the eastern coast of North America not as it was later drawn, but as it might have appeared to the earliest European explorers. But what made Miss Marple's breath catch was not the coastline, it was the markings inland. "Villages," she murmured. "Colonies," Lydia corrected, "but very early. Earlier than any official settlement records, earlier than Jamestown." So Roland asked. "Yes," Lydia whispered. "If this is authentic, it means someone was there long before the histories tell us." And then Miss Marple leaned closer, her gaze narrowing to one particular symbol, a circle with radiating lines. She tapped it gently with her fingertip. "This," she said, "is the same symbol we saw carved in the old chest discovered beneath the well yesterday, the sun mark." Andreas nodded. "The one that matched the early signatures of those anonymous settlers." Miss Marple sat slowly, "which means whoever carried this map inherited knowledge from people who had already been here, quiet settlers, forgotten, unnamed." Sir Roland frowned. "Why hide this? Why isn't this in any museum?" Miss Marple looked up, her expression soft but undeniable. "Because someone, somewhere, preferred a cleaner story. One that began with grand ships and kings, not with frightened farmers and wandering craftsmen trying to survive a new world." Lydia turned one more page and gasped. Folded into the back of the folio was a letter, written in looping handwriting that shimmered slightly as if time had refused to dull its urgency. Lydia lifted it by the edges. "It's in English," she said. "17th century." "Read it aloud," Miss Marple said gently. Lydia cleared her throat. "To whoever finds this, know that our first settlement is not the first. We were welcomed by those who came long before, who marked the land with sunstones and left us warnings, in symbols we barely understood. We write this so history will not forget those whose names we never learned. If our colony survives, may truth survive with it." The room fell silent. "Sunstones," Miss Marple repeated softly. "And warnings." Andreas looked from the map to the letter. "So the earliest settlers weren't alone." "No," Miss Marple said, "they were not. And whoever lived there before them, they vanished from official records, wiped out." Sir Roland asked, "Or written out," she replied calmly. Then Lydia pulled something else from the folio, another map. This one marked with red crosses, along the northern coast. "What are those?" Andreas asked. Lydia stared at them. "Failed colonies," she said. "Abandoned, or lost." Miss Marple touched one cross thoughtfully. "No colony fails without reason. Hunger, fear, conflict. Or something far quieter, but equally dangerous." Sir Roland swallowed. "Do you think we're uncovering something people didn't want known?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "My dear Sir Roland, most truths begin with someone not wanting them known." Later that morning, Miss Marple stepped outside the archive building, letting the sunlight warm her face. The village buzzed with normal morning activity, children running, fishermen preparing nets, but she felt the weight of the forgotten settlers lingering like a shifting shadow. As Lydia and Andreas prepared to present their findings to the museum's board, Miss Marple wandered to the edge of the cliffs. She stood quietly, listening to the sea. Waves crashed against the rocks below, steady, rhythmic, everlasting. "They must have felt this too," she murmured. "The first settlers, the fear of the unknown, the hope of a new start, and the danger of stories not told." She thought of the anonymous hands that had drawn the map, the trembling ink strokes that tried to preserve what official history did not record. She thought of the symbols carved in the chest. They'd unearthed the same sun mark now on the map. They weren't just settlers, she whispered. They were inheritors. A soft footstep approached behind her. "Sir Roland, you're troubled," he said. "No," Miss Marple said with a faint smile. "Just remembering that history is rarely what it claims to be." "Do you believe this changes the story of America's founding?" Miss Marple looked at him, her eyes full of quiet certainty. "It restores its honesty," she said, "and truth is always richer than myth." By afternoon, scholars from nearby towns arrived to study the folio. Lydia stood at the center of the room, steady and confident, as she explained the significance of the maps. Andreas managed the artifacts with care bordering on reverence. Sir Roland, to his own surprise, defended the team with more passion than anyone expected. Miss Marple sat in a corner chair, observing with a contented smile. She noticed small details: a scholar's raised eyebrow, a hurried whisper, a hand gripping a notebook too tightly, resistance, curiosity, fear, discovery, all in one room. Just like the earliest colonies, when the sun began to set, Lydia walked over to her. "Miss Marple, this is bigger than we ever expected." "Yes, my dear," she said. "Truth usually is." "And the map, what do we do with it?" Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "You do what the original settlers asked, which is, make sure history does not forget those who came before." Lydia nodded slowly, the weight of responsibility settling in her shoulders. As evening fell over the village, Miss Marple stepped outside once more. The sky was painted in gold and violet. Sea wind brushed her face. "Stories survive," she whispered, "even when names don't." And somewhere across the ocean, across centuries, the first settlers of the New World felt remembered. Chapter 6. The Map That Lead. 1,000 words, 5 equal parts. The candle flame trembled, as though the parchment itself were breathing. Miss Marple leaned closer, her spectacles catching the faint golden shimmer of the ink. The map, brittle, browned, and edged with salt crystal, should not have existed. It showed a coastline of the New World long before any official record claimed it had been charted. Lydia Reinhardt, nervous yet thrilled, whispered, "Miss Marple, this changes everything." Miss Marple smiled gently. "My dear, anything that changes everything usually begins with someone who wanted to hide something." She tapped the map lightly. "Let us see who that someone is." A soft knock interrupted them. Young Ethan Hale burst into the room, breathless, hair wine-tossed from the harbour. "Miss Marple, you must see this." Captain Harrow found another crate beneath the floorboards of the old tavern. "It's filled with papers. And something else." He held up a sealed wooden tube, bound with wax so old it had cracked like winter ice. They gathered around as Miss Marple gently broke the seal with the edge of a letter opener. Inside was another map, this one darker, drawn with a sharper hand and marked with peculiar symbols, arrows, crosses, and faint circles. Lydia frowned. A second map, but why hide two? Miss Marple placed the two parchments side by side. "Because," she said softly, "the truth never travels alone. It needs a companion, a lie." She lifted the darker map. This one was meant for the officials. She lifted the lighter one. "And this one, for the sailors." Ethan blinked. "Why would they be different?" "Because," Miss Marple replied. "Someone wanted the colonies to be planted, not where the crown believed, but where private hands profited most." They walked to the harbour, maps carefully rolled, lanterns flickering in the salty wind. Captain Harrow, a broad man with tired eyes, greeted them. "Miss Marple, I swear those crates weren't there 2 days ago." Miss Marple scanned the shoreline. "Storms reveal what guilt has buried," she murmured. Inside the tavern cellar, the new crate held letters, dozens of them. The handwriting was neat, calculated, unlike the rough strokes of frontier men. Lydia picked one up. "Look, addressed to Lord Aylesford, dated 1623. Inside were instructions to redirect ships to a secondary landing, farther south than the official route." Ethan read another. "And this one, it says the colonists were told there was fertile land and peace waiting for them, but they were sent into territory already claimed by native tribes." Miss Marple's voice softened. "And thus, conflict was not accident, but design, manufactured to weaken both sides." She turned to Lydia. "My dear, these letters are not records, they are blueprints." Lydia shivered. "Blueprints for what?" "Control," Miss Marple said. "The colonies were not meant to flourish. They were meant to depend." Back outside, the wind rose sharply, carrying the smell of distant rain. Miss Marple stood on the dock, eyes narrowing at the restless sea. "Ethan," she said suddenly, "when did the crate appear?" "Right after the storm," he said. Captain Harrow found the floorboards lifted by the water. Miss Marple nodded. "Then someone knew we were close. And they tried to wash the truth away." Lydia's eyes widened. "You think the crate was meant to be destroyed?" "Of course," Miss Marple said calmly. "Storms do not open sealed floorboards unless hands open them first." Ethan stepped back. "So someone in the village." Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. She was listening, not to the sea, but to the pattern beneath it, hurried footsteps faintly echoing on the pier, a lantern swinging in the dark, a figure slipping into the shadows. She nodded slowly. "Yes, someone here still believes that past must stay buried." She lifted the two maps again. "But these," she whispered, refused to stay silent. Lydia swallowed. "What now?" "We follow the lies," Miss Marple said with quiet certainty. "Lies always lead somewhere, usually to the one who fears the truth most." She pointed at the coastline drawn on both maps. "We start here. The colonies did not begin where they claimed, and someone is afraid we might prove it." Ethan took a shaky breath. "Miss Marple, do you think they're watching us now?" A lantern flickered on the far end of the dock, a signal, or a warning, and disappeared. Miss Marple's smile was thin but fearless. "My dear boy, I would be disappointed if they weren't." Chapter 7. The Hidden Map in the Firelight. The night Miss Marple uncovered the clue was the only night the fire refused to burn straight. Flames in the old river cabin leapt sideways, scattering sparks like frightened birds. Lydia Hale, her local historian companion, stepped back, startled. "It's never done that before," she whispered. But Miss Marple leaned in, eyes narrowed, watching the logs shift as if pushed by an invisible hand. The firelight reflected off a glossy layer of wood that had no place in a simple cabin hearth. "This log," she murmured, tapping it with her cane, "isn't firewood at all." She pulled it out with the poker. The outer bark slid away in a clean sheet, revealing a hollow wooden cylinder, sealed at both ends with wax, and carved with a pattern of 17 tiny stars. Lydia gasped. 17. The number of early English settlements on the Atlantic coast before the colonies formed. Miss Marple's smile deepened. "I rather thought so." But before they could open it, the wind outside slammed the shutters hard enough to shake dust from the rafters. Somewhere in the darkness, something moved, footsteps, perhaps, or the shifting of someone trying very hard not to be heard. "Someone else knows this cylinder exists," Miss Marple said softly, "and they desperately want it back." They sealed the door and lit a second lamp. Lydia's hands trembled as she cut the wax caps with a penknife. Inside lay a tightly rolled parchment, brittle with age. As she unrolled it, both women leaned close, breath held in the fragile silence of discovery. It was a map, but unlike any they had seen. Not of America, but of England's coast. Tiny arrows crossed the Atlantic in faded brown ink, each marked with a date. Most were expected: 1607, 1620, 1634, but one arrow older, darker, was labelled 1579. 1579. Lydia whispered. "That's before Roanoke." "Before Jamestown, before everything," Miss Marple nodded. "Someone crossed the Atlantic long before official records. Likely a scouting voyage. If that is true, the colonies weren't founded by chance. They were planned long in advance, quietly, deliberately." The fire hissed behind them. Miss Marple turned one corner of the map to the light. Embedded near the edge was a faint symbol, a crescent moon crossed by a horizontal line. "The seal of the observers," she said. Lydia blinked. "Who?" "A silent council of early navigators. Men who believed empires should expand without public debate. If they hid this map, it's because the colonies didn't begin with freedom, but with secrecy." A floorboard creaked behind them. They froze. Miss Marple extinguished the lamp instantly. Darkness swallowed the cabin. Only the faint glow of the dying fire left thin amber lines across the floor. They listened still, breath shallow. Then came the soft scrape of metal sliding against wood. A knife. Lydia's hand flew to her mouth. Miss Marple pointed toward the back wall, a narrow pantry door. They moved silently, stepping around the loose boards. A shadow passed across the front window, broad shoulders, slow movement. Someone accustomed to waiting. "Not a thief," Miss Marple whispered, "a watcher." They slipped into the pantry and closed the door just enough to leave a thread of visibility. The intruder entered the cabin, tall and cloaked, his boots silent. He moved straight to the fireplace, as if he knew exactly where the wooden cylinder had been hidden. He lifted the cylinder's discarded bark covering, inspected it, then growled softly, a frustrated sound. Miss Marple felt Lydia trembling beside her. She squeezed the girl's arm gently. "Fear is useful," she whispered. "It tells us when to think quickly." The cloaked man moved toward the table, where the map lay half rolled. But Miss Marple had taken it with her into the pantry. Finding nothing, he swept the room once more, muttered something in an unfamiliar dialect, and slipped out into the night. They waited until his footsteps faded into the trees. Only then did they breathe again. Hours later, safely inside Sheriff Dalton's office, the map lay unrolled under a brighter lamp. Dalton stared at it, scratching his mustache. "So you're telling me," he said slowly, "that the American colonies might have been planned decades before anyone admits." Miss Marple poured tea from a paper cup, perfectly composed. "Not only planned," she said, "but orchestrated by a group who preferred decisions made in shadow. Look at the arrows the routes take advantage of ocean currents that weren't officially charted until much later." Lydia pointed at the curious crescent symbol. "And this appears again near the date 1579. Whoever made this map wanted that voyage to be remembered. Or feared," Dalton exhaled. "If this gets out, it rewrites history." "History is always rewritten," Miss Marple said gently. "The trick is to write it truthfully." Just then, the front door rattled violently. Lydia jumped. Dalton reached for his rifle. But Miss Marple remained calm, setting her tea aside. "Not him again," she said. "He doesn't knock." Dalton opened the door. On the porch stood an elderly native man wrapped in a wool blanket, his gaze steady and knowing. "I heard," he said softly, pointing to the map. "I know that symbol. My grandfather told me the story." Miss Marple rose, eyes bright. "I was hoping someone would." The room fell silent as he began to speak. The elder introduced himself as Tall Cedar, a keeper of oral memory. He sat near the map, touching the crescent symbol with a reverent finger. "This mark," he said, "was carried by a ship that came long before the others. Its men were silent, cautious. They did not stay long. But they left gifts and warnings." "What warnings?" Lydia asked. Tall Cedar looked at Miss Marple, as though recognizing in her the one, mind ready to understand. That if the newcomers came in secret, they would build their future in secret too. Dalton swallowed. So the colonies weren't founded on cooperation. They were founded on shadows, Tall Cedar finished. Miss Marple folded her hands. "Then it seems," she said softly, "that this investigation is much bigger than a lost map. It is about the silence before history and who chose to keep it silent." Tall Cedar nodded. "You have awakened an old truth. Now you must decide what to do with it." The fire outside crackled as if answering. The wind carried the distant echo of waves, echoes of crossings long forgotten. Miss Marple unrolled the map fully and studied it with calm intensity. "We will follow the 1579 route," she said. "Whatever began then, that is where the true story starts." And in that moment, the investigation shifted, no longer about colonies alone, but about the first secret voyage that shaped all that came after. Chapter 8: The Colony That Should Not Exist. Miss Marple felt it the moment she stepped out of the small guest house and onto the damp trail leading toward the hidden settlement the map had hinted at. The moon hung low, silver-edged, touching every leaf with a wary glow. Lydia Carrow walked beside her, lantern held close to her chest, breath steady, but eyes sharp. "You're certain the map pointed here?" Lydia whispered. Miss Marple nodded. The ink faded, but the hand that drew it was consistent. Whoever hid that map meant someone, someday, to find this place. The wind stirred faintly, not enough to move leaves, only enough to whisper through them. Ahead, a structure revealed itself between the trees. A wooden fence, older than the village records, older than any colonial dates Lydia had ever studied. A single gate stood ajar, as if awaiting their arrival. Miss Marple paused only once, studying the ground. "Do you hear that?" Lydia frowned. "No." "Exactly," Miss Marple said. "A silence that's shaped, not natural." They stepped inside the forgotten colony. The settlement was small, no more than 6 cabins arranged around a circular clearing. But what struck Lydia first was not their number, but their design. "These aren't English," she murmured. "Not fully, at least." Miss Marple traced her fingers along the edge of a cabin's doorframe. "Joint work like this is more Scandinavian." "And the roof pitch is Dutch, mixed settlers?" Lydia asked. "Or settlers who trusted one another more than they trusted their homelands," Miss Marple said. They entered the first cabin. Dust shimmered in the lantern light. A single table, carved with 12 symbols, a sun, a leaf, a compass, a wave. Lydia's breath caught. These are not European symbols. They resemble early Algonquin shapes." Miss Marple smiled gently. "I wondered if you'd see it." Across the walls, faint strokes revealed a dialogue, not written language, but marks matching the rhythm of the Algonquin council gatherings. "This colony wasn't simply formed," Miss Marple said. "It was negotiated, Europeans and indigenous leaders working together. A model colony, forgotten because it was inconvenient." Lydia stared at the table, voice hushed. "If this is true, it changes everything." Miss Marple touched one of the symbols. "Stories often survive better than history. They are too light for governments to bury." A rustling noise stopped their study. Lydia froze. Miss Marple quietly motioned her to extinguish the lantern. The old settlement went utterly dark, except for the faint moonlight slipping through the roof gaps. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circumventing the cabins. Miss Marple leaned close. "We're not the only ones who know this place exists." A silhouette moved past the doorway, broad-shouldered, familiar. Lydia tensed. "That's Mr. Prescott, the historian from Boston." "But why would he?" Miss Marple placed a finger to her lips. Prescott knelt near the center clearing, brushing away leaves to reveal the circular emblem carved into the earth, 12 smaller circles around a larger one. He pulled something from his coat, a chisel. "He's going to remove it," Lydia hissed. "No," Miss Marple whispered. "Not remove, destroy." Before Lydia could act, Miss Marple stepped out with the calmness of someone entering a parlor rather than confronting treachery. "Good evening, Mr. Prescott," she said, as if greeting him for tea. He jerked upright, startled. "Miss Marple, what on earth?" "You are about to strike the only physical proof of an equal colony," she said mildly. "Why?" His silence told the truth before his lips could try to hide it. Prescott's voice broke into the stillness, defensive and cracked. "Don't you understand? If this settlement is authenticated, every narrative of the colonial foundations changes. My research, my career, everything becomes irrelevant." Lydia stepped forward, fury trembling beneath her composure. "You would erase an entire colony to protect your reputation?" Prescott's jaw tightened. "History belongs to those who record it. This collaboration makes the early settlers look weak, indecisive, dependent on tribes they were supposed to overcome." Miss Marple shook her head slowly. "Ah, pride, always the oldest enemy of truth." He raised the chisel again. Lydia gasped, but Miss Marple spoke softly. "Mr. Prescott, do you think the forest will forget?" He froze. Miss Marple continued. "Even if you gouge out the symbol, the trees have recorded every season, every meeting, every agreement made here. The soil carries the ashes of shared fires. This place will not vanish because you chip at one design. Prescott's shoulder sagged. The chisel slipped from his hand. You don't understand, he whispered. No one will read my work. Miss Marple stepped close, placing a gentle but firm hand on his sleeve. Truth is not lost because one man fails to write it. It is lost when many decide not to look. He collapsed onto the ground, defeated not by her criticism, but by her clarity. Together, they carried Prescott back toward the main trail. He walked silently, like someone finally freed from the weight of his own schemes. The forest no longer felt like it was watching. Instead, it breathed more naturally, as though relieved. When they reached the edge of the village, Lydia stopped. Miss Marple. This settlement, this meeting of cultures, it was peaceful, cooperative. Miss Marple nodded. Precisely why it was forgotten. Peace rarely writes its own legend. And what will we do now? Lydia asked. Reveal it. Miss Marple looked back at the dark forest, where the hidden colony slept beneath centuries of leaf and silence. We will tell its story, she said, but gently. Truth must be carried, not thrown. Lydia smiled. And Mr. Prescott? He will understand, Miss Marple said. He has already begun to. They walked together toward the inn, lantern light warming the dusk. Behind them, the forest settled into quiet. Not the shaped silence Miss Marple had felt earlier, but a contented silence, deep and natural. A silence that protects rather than conceals. Miss Marple paused once more, listening. No wind, no fear. Only the memory of cooperation carved into the earth. Another forgotten beginning, she whispered, now remembered again. Chapter 9. The Fire in the Harbour. The night the harbour caught light, Miss Marple understood something she had been circling for days. It wasn't the faint orange glow on the horizon that alarmed her, nor the distant shouts of sailors. It was the pattern of the flames. They rose in intervals, as if answering one another from ship to ship. Not chaos, not accident, a signal. She stood on the cliff path above the settlement, the wind pushing cold salt air toward her, and watched the fire spread with eerie precision. This is not the beginning of rebellion, she murmured. It is the beginning of a message. Lydia ran up behind her, breathless. Miss Marple, one of the merchant ships exploded. The villagers think the British regulars did it. All the colonists, all smugglers. Yes, Miss Marple said gently. Which means it was none of them. Lydia blinked. None. Miss Marple nodded, eyes narrowed. This was coordinated. A hand outside all three circles, and below, the harbour continued to burn, but in rhythm. By the time they reached the docks, the air was thick with smoke and accusations. Sailors shouted at soldiers, soldiers at merchants, merchants at the stunned townsfolk. A young lieutenant pointed at a colonist crew holding buckets. They set fire to the ship. They want war. The crew shouted back with equal fury. We were asleep. We almost died. You fools. Miss Marple pressed her cane against the lieutenant's boot gently. If they had set the fire, she asked softly, why would they be throwing water on their own vessel? The lieutenant flushed. Well, who else? That is the right question, she said. Follow the evidence, not the anger. She stepped closer to the burning wreck. Despite the chaos, something on the deck caught her eye. A thick tar rope, cut cleanly. Not frayed, not burned, cut. Someone didn't want the ship to leave port. A shadow moved behind her. It was Sir Rowland, coat thrown over his shoulder, eyes scanning for threat. This is sabotage. The governor will blame the colonists. They'll retaliate. Blood will follow. Yes, Miss Marple said. unless we find the one who lit the match. The next morning, she gathered the clues on a table at the inn: a burnt piece of parchment, a torn silk ribbon found in the harbour, and a strange metal fragment resembling a fuse casing. Lydia hovered over them. This doesn't look like political anger. This looks like engineering. Indeed, Miss Marple held the casing up to the light. This is not British design, nor colonial. Sir Rowland frowned. Then French. Miss Marple shook her head. Too refined. Lydia gasped. Spanish. No, Miss Marple said again, tapping the metal softly. Too thin. Then she smiled, a calm, devastating smile. Dutch. Sir Rowland straightened. Dutch merchants, but they trade with everyone. They also wish to keep that privilege, Miss Marple replied. And if the British tighten their control over these colonies, Dutch trading freedoms vanish. Lydia whispered, so if the colonies rebel, the Dutch profit. Miss Marple finished, through chaos, markets open. Sir Rowland sank into a chair. Good heavens. We've been blaming the wrong men, and you might start a war based on that. Miss Marple placed the burnt parchment beside the casing. We must uncover the rest before the governor arrives. The truth is deeper than a fire. She walked alone to the far end of the harbour, where smaller boats bobbed quietly. Smoke still drifted from the burned ship, but here the water was calm. Behind a stack of crates, she found what she was looking for: footprints in the soot, leading away from the docks toward the old granary. Heavy boots, 3 pairs, moving with purpose. Inside the granary, dust floated like imprisoned stars. Then she heard it, a faint metallic clink. She stepped softly, cane tapping measured beats. At the far wall, an oil lantern glowed around 3 crates stamped with a tulip insignia. Dutch cargo. She opened one gently. Inside lay coils of the same fuse wire she found on the wreck. Footsteps sounded behind her. She did not turn. She never turned first. If you're going to shut the door, she said calmly, please do so quietly. Dust travels when frightened. A tall Dutch merchant stepped from the shadows, face pale. Behind him, 2 men with rope. Madame, the merchant said, you walk where you should not. Miss Marple sighed. I rarely do what I should. You ruined everything, he hissed. The colonies needed a push, a little spark. A spark that burns people, she replied, is never political. Only cruel. The men approached. Miss Marple stepped back, but she was not afraid. I wouldn't recommend that, came Sir Rowland's voice behind the merchant. Soldiers flooded in behind him. Your commercial diplomacy ends here. The merchant froze. Miss Marple brushed dust from her sleeve. Really, Sir Rowland, you do arrive fashionably. By evening, Dutch agents were arrested, the harbour soothed, and the colonists relieved, though confused. Lydia stood beside Miss Marple on the cliff path, overlooking the calm water. It wasn't about fear, Lydia said quietly. It was about profit. Yes, Miss Marple replied. Fear is merely the wind. Profit is the hand that shapes the sails, and the colonies, what now? Miss Marple watched the sunset spill gold across the ocean. They will rise or fall by their own decisions, not by sabotage. She turned to Lydia. What we witness today is not the start of democracy, nor rebellion. But it is the start of something else, the first realization of unity among the colonists. They stood together against a false accusation. And that, she said softly, is how nations begin. Lydia shivered. So this, all of this, will turn into history someday. Miss Marple nodded. Every great story begins with someone refusing to be blamed for something they didn't do. Behind them, the harbour bell rang. calm, unhurried, honest. Chapter 10. The Map That Chose Its Own Borders. The night Miss Marple made her final discovery, the sky above the old Boston Library glowed like a lantern. A storm hovered offshore, but the air inside the archive room was still enough for truth to settle. Miss Marple stood before the long wooden table where the sealed colonial map lay beneath glass. But it wasn't the map alone that caught her attention. It was the faint ripple in the parchment, almost like breath. She had watched that map for 3 days. She had memorized every coastline and quill stroke. But tonight, she had returned because of a single sentence whispered by the elderly librarian earlier. This map was not drawn. It was agreed upon, not imposed. That one word had stirred Miss Marple's curiosity, and a tide turning under moonlight. She lifted her magnifying lens, tracing a line that had bothered her from the beginning, a boundary between 2 early colonies where the ink was strangely different, an uneven shade, a second hand. A compromise, not a decree. Footsteps approached. Lydia Whitlock entered with 2 steaming cups. "You're still here," she whispered. "Still watching that border like it might confess." Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, it has already confessed. I am only waiting for it to finish its story." By morning, the storm had cleared, and the old meeting hall looked almost ceremonial. The Colonial Council members, scholars, naval officers, and Dr. Jonathan Hale assembled around Miss Marple as she requested. The great map was unrolled before them like a courtroom witness. "You asked us to gather for a revelation," Dr. Hale said. "I assume you've found something remarkable." "Oh, not remarkable," Miss Marple answered sweetly, "only true." Her eyes softened as she placed her hand upon the disputed line. "You all believe the American colonies were established through hard authority, charters, kings, land claims, oceans conquered. But this map tells a different story," Professor Willis scoffed. "Madam, the borders here reflect royal commands. They were sent from London, not negotiated." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "but people do not live on commands. They live on agreements." She pointed to the faded brown ink. "This boundary was altered. Not by a king, but by colonists who traded tools, food, and peace. They redrew this line, so neither side would starve the winter before the first charter arrived." Lydia leaned forward, meaning the first colonial line wasn't forced by empire, but chosen by neighbors. The hall rustled with disbelief. Miss Marple continued, "And there is more." She touched a symbol she had discovered the night before, a tiny circle etched behind the ink. "A vote," she said softly, "the first vote in the colonies. Carved secretly into the parchment by a sailor who witnessed the moment." Their silence deepened as Miss Marple rolled out a second document. The weathered logbook she and Lydia had discovered in the cabin of the abandoned ship. "This," she said, "belongs to the sailor who carved that circle." Colonel Harwood frowned. "A sailor? Why would his account matter?" "Because he was the only one who wrote without an audience," Miss Marple replied. "And that makes him the only one who told the truth." She read aloud. "Greater than the men of the North, and the men of the South spoke long by the fire. No guns were drawn, no threats made. They placed 12 pebbles upon a plank, 5 for the North, 5 for the South, to for the river. The river chose the line, the river chose the line." Someone repeated. Miss Marple nodded. "He meant the river's resources were shared. They placed 2 pebbles in the middle, symbolizing neutral land. That was the first colonial compromise." Dr. Hale looked stunned. "You mean the colonies began not by dominance, but by cooperation?" Miss Marple smiled. "Exactly. Before empires claimed them, before politics divided them, The land was shared because human beings knew survival depended on patience. She closed the logbook gently. That, she said, is the beginning of America. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple returned alone to the riverside cabin, where the sailor's chest had been hidden. Dust floated like whispers in the slanted light. She sat at the rough wooden table, running her fingers along the groove where the sailor had carved the circle again and again, perhaps hoping someone in a distant future would finally understand. Lydia soon joined her. Breathless from running, Miss Marple, the historians, are arguing, someone to suppress your finding. It challenges the established narrative. It challenges pride, Miss Marple corrected gently. Pride does not like to remember that peace is older than power. But what should we tell them? Lydia asked. The truth, Miss Marple answered. And if they reject it, we will tell it again tomorrow. The young woman exhaled. Sometimes I wish all of history sounded like you. Miss Marple chuckled. History does sound like me. At least the parts nobody listens to, outside. The river murmured softly as if in agreement. That evening, the scholars gathered reluctantly at the village's stone courtyard, not because they wished to accept Miss Marple's findings, but because even they could not resist the weight of evidence. Miss Marple stood before them, small but steady. People like to believe nations are founded on declarations, battles, and grand speeches, she said. But the truth is almost always quieter. The wind rustled through the trees. America began, she continued, when strangers sat together by firelight, placed pebbles on a plank, and agreed to share a river. That was the first colony. That was the first vote. Everything that followed was noise, loud, important, historical noise, but noise nonetheless. The council members stared, humbled. Miss Marple finished softly. Empires impose borders. People decide how to live inside them. As the scholars dispersed, some thoughtful, some shaken, Miss Marple remained by the river, watching the moon ripple on its surface. The water glowed faintly, like it remembered, like it approved. And Miss Marple, gentle and wise, smiled at the truth she had uncovered. Sometimes the quietest moment in history is the one that changed everything.